Right, okay.
It'll be just a moment, and then it'll be ready for you. Okay, I think you're all right.
Okay, I don't seem to have hands, people, today, so it might be a wave of hands if that's okay.
Yeah.
Good morning and welcome, everyone. This is our final PCC, which seems really strange, and it seems 2 minutes ago since I read a report from Phil Metham, which said about my first PCC meeting that I was very polite and calm. Probably this morning after our IT issues, my little feet are going like mad, and I'm sure the rest of you are a little bit stressed. So we'll keep it calm. But nevertheless, a real warm welcome. I start with apologies. So we have apologies from Phil Metham, from Paula Evans, Dr. Paula Evans, sorry, Dr. Andrew Moriarty, and Sharon Stoltz from the York City Council. Declarations of interest. So if we can capture those as we go, unless anyone has anything that they need to disclose to me now. No? Okay, thank you. Carry on. We're going to approve the minutes of our second meeting first, just to make sure that we've got our ducks in a row, if that's okay. So if I can have agreement that you've received and read the minutes and you approve them, then we'll carry on with this meeting. Thank you all. That's wonderful. Right, matters arising, Sean. I'm not sure how we're doing with that. Did you want to update us a little?
Yes, I can give you a quick update. So we've a couple of developments. So we don't have the report from our colleagues in NEX yet. What they need to do is to go out to practices to get effectively a data sharing agreement back from each practice. Across North Yorkshire and York, they've had a limited number of responses from practices, which I can understand. We send out a lot of requests for DSAs. And we really have to work with practices to kind of help them understand what the benefits are for these reports and these bits of data. So we're still working with NEXT to get that report mobilized and out to practices, because I do think it gives some helpful information, not only about appointments by clinician type, but about some of the case mix and the conditions that they're seeing as well. But in parallel with that, we've had some recent developments around the GP appointment data, which is collected nationally. And we have a bit more detail in that data now. All of our practices provide that data to NHS Digital. They've all standardized their appointments as per the sort of national standard categories. But if I can just read out the latest information on the GPAD data. So the dashboard data is updated on a weekly basis every Thursday at 10 a.m. The dashboard provides an overview of appointments of general practice and includes measures such as the total number of appointments, the appointment status, so whether that's DNA, the mode of delivery, such as face-to-face and telephone, the healthcare professional carrying them out, so a GP or other practice staff, and the time between the booking and appointment. So it feels as though nationally NHS Digital is kind of catching up in terms of the type of reporting that we set out to try and deliver locally. So I think what I'm going to do is as we move forward, obviously I'll keep working with NEXT colleagues to understand what information they can provide to practices. But also, I think we can link in with practices to try and understand how they're working with that data, which is now provided nationally. So the GPAD data is provided to every practice individually. We can't see that in that detail, but practices do have that detail. So I will take an action to have a conversation with our practices just to understand what they can see in those GPAD data reports and how useful that is going forward. But it does feel as though we're making a bit of progress nationally, at least, even if we're not quite there with the data sharing agreements for those local reports, if that's helpful.
It's very helpful, Sean. I think for us, we realised it was a really big task under the circumstances, but I actually think that it's going to be invaluable, and to have that standardisation will be really, really helpful, and I hope that it will enable our practices to look at what they're doing, what they're delivering, how they're delivering it, and plan for the future. And somewhere in there to send a message out to patients that actually our GPs are still there, they're delivering. They might be delivering differently. There are other additional roles that actually provide a brilliant service as well. So if we can do all of that, I think that's wonderful. So thank you. I think we've got further on than we had hoped. So that is a really good plus. It's making us smile.
Yeah, it feels like we have made a bit of progress, and I think it's an area which has always interested in me. So as we move forward into the ICB, I will still be kind of pursuing that data, that operational data for practices, with a view to it helping with service improvement.
And I think for all of us, that is really reassuring. So thank you, because of course, a lot of our staff will still be part of the future. In a real positive way, so we won't lose the impetus of the fabulous work that's going on. Right, thank you, Sean. Simon, it's over to you for the financial update, please.
Thanks, Julie. Because it's so early in the financial year and this committee is quite early in the month, there's no specific primary care report. We've only just finished the month 2 report for Finance Committee, which is next week, but spoiler alert, I guess, for Finance Committee members, but the report will show that overall at month 2, the CCG's got an adverse variance at month 2 of £29,000, so relatively small. We're still predicting forecast for month 3 break even, month 3 being the end of the CCG. Final plans submitted last week, which across the ICB show a break-even position, although still risks to be managed within that. So that's probably all I had to update the committee on, Julie. But all looking okay from York's perspective at this point.
Thank you. That's reassuring, Simon, and I'm sure that it will be at David's Finance and Performance Committee in much more detail, and we'll be able to report to our community. Thank you all. Fiona, that I see you're next for the primary care update. Did you want to wait for Gary to join you?
If that's all right, Julie, that would be great, because it'd be important for us to do a double act.
Yeah, we'll juggle, because I know he's on another meeting. Steph, can I hand over to you for the coronavirus update then?
Yeah, certainly. I'll start by thanking team members who've provided this information, and Sean's on the call, so if there's anything to add, Sean will interject. So let's just start with the COVID rate tracker, because it's the one bit of information, I guess, that has fallen into the background of our conversations as the national news focuses on other things. But as we're minded to say, COVID-19 hasn't gone away. Last week and this week, we are seeing an increase in positive cases. The national 7-day rate was 62 per 100,000 last week. It's 103 today per 100,000, and York and North Yorkshire rates are above that national average. Now, I know that testing isn't something that is now routinely done, but our public health colleagues are continuing to track through a range of methodologies, particularly people on trials. It's just to sort of highlight to people that York and North Yorkshire are seeing a higher rates. That's particularly important given that hospitals are opening up, visiting again. Healthcare settings are starting to have that conversation about changing the way they use PPE when they're engaged in consultations, generally, as opposed to aerosol generating procedures. So, but it's still an infection that is increasing. So I'd urge our own staff and members of the public who are listening to this just to continue to be vigilant. Now, we've always said that the best defence is vaccination, and we've been vaccinating most of our population with a view to reducing death and harm to individuals. So in the Vale of York, most of our PCN sites have paused. So people will be aware that our primary care colleagues, with the support of secondary care and the voluntary sector and pharmacies, have done phenomenal work standing up, flexing the vaccination programme. Well, they on the whole are just sort of laying low, and our primary offer will continue at Askenbar Vaccination Centre and through community pharmacies. We still, and I say the royal we, it's Sean and Shamim with our providers who are leading this programme now. We're still responding to national asks, and the latest one that's nearing conclusion is the remaining care homes and housebound vaccinations, and we've just started a programme for immune suppressed patients who are eligible for their second booster. So in our language, that's actually a 5th dose, we're just going through that process now. If you're eligible, you really shouldn't go 6 months without another top up. So, you know, just to, given this is our last meeting, and the vaccination programme has been the silver lining in what has otherwise been a very challenging period for CCGs and our providers, along with the rest of the population. In the Vale of York, we've got almost 102,000 patients within priority groups to be vaccinated, and almost 87% have been fully vaccinated. And of that 87%, and we talk about fully vaccinated being a first and second dose, almost 90% of those have been fully vaccinated with a booster of some variation based on their eligibility. So, you know, I mean, when we think about that, given that this is a voluntary vaccination programme, to getting up to 90% of the eligible population to be protected with one of the vaccines is really pretty special. We're just concluding our care home vaccinations, and in the springtime there was a booster campaign, but you've heard me talk about infection rates increasing. We did have an Omicron outbreak in some care homes early June, and we would advise that you don't go in and vaccinate for a period of time without risk assessing. So, but almost 84% of all care home residents have now been vaccinated across the region, and we're at 92% of that. So we're doing really well in offering that. So I'll conclude there just to say, you know, the vaccination scheme is still the best way to protect yourself. We have the evergreen offer, but clearly the numbers are much reduced now. But if there's anybody who is thinking, oh, I won't be eligible or won't be able to get a vaccine, please do get in touch through contact us, our website, and we'll have that conversation with you and facilitate a vaccine. It remains the best way to mitigate the ill effects of COVID-19. And so, again, as I started, I thank the team in the CCG, our colleagues in secondary care, and those providers and voluntary sector colleagues who've made the vaccine programme such a phenomenal success. Thank you.
Thank you, Steph. And I'd like to offer my thanks as well to everyone that's been involved in that, all the way through, clinicians, volunteers, just everybody that's given their time to work their socks off towards this, and all of the admin and the investing and that goes behind it. So it's time and emotional time, isn't it? A huge coup, I think. And please take that offer up, that evergreen offer. Any questions or comments for Steph? No. Okay. Fiona, shall we still skip forward a little bit until Gary arrives? Is that okay?
Yeah, if you've got one more item you can do, and then if not, we'll start anyway.
We can I pass over to you then for the risk report, Sean?
Yes, certainly. I'll just find it on my paper. So I can't see while I'm talking through it. So please shout out if there are any questions as I move through. So I'll start with the serious mental illness health checks. So it's really good news for this one. I've actually reduced the risk score from 12 to 8 this month based on the data that we've received for Q4 of 21-22. So Q4 of last year, so the close of last year, our practices collectively achieved a 58.8% completion of the SMI health checks. That's against a national target of 60%. So really close. And that was a significant improvement on any performance achievement, that practices had achieved previously. So I think we have to say well done to practices. They've done a huge amount of work on this over the past year. And actually for Q4, Vale of York CCG achieved the highest performance across Humber and North Yorkshire. So some real kind of progress there. So thank you to practices, and also thank you to Sheila Fletcher in the CCG, who's been coordinating this work as well. So highlights, points to note: Stillington Surgery achieved 100% of their SMI health checks with all 6 elements carried out in the past 12 months. So well done to Stillington. And if we I shouldn't compare probably, but if we want to compare the city practices, a little bit of friendly competition, and the Vale practices, the Vale PCNs achieved 70.8% against that national target of 60, and the city practices were just a little bit behind with 54%. So I think there's been a lot of learning around this over the past 12 months, with PCNs kind of sharing a lot of that learning information. So I think as we go forward into this year, we'll see even more improvements. And we do have an extension to funding for some of the support and outreach and engagement work around health checks. So that will help this year. And there are a number of initiatives that PCNs are taking on board to try and increase how they connect with these patients and how they complete these health checks for these sort of more vulnerable patients. So good news for the SMI health checks. The next risk is the access to general practice, which I've left at a score of 12. We've seen a very slight dip in appointment numbers in April, which is the latest data. There are some seasonal fluctuations in this data, which we see, and actually the April data could have been impacted by the double bank holiday, the Easter bank holiday, which could have accounted for, you know, a slight reduction in appointment numbers. But broadly speaking, you know, the trajectory is still just heading slightly upwards in terms of appointment numbers, which is good. We still do have concerns around access from patients, although I think some of the noise has subsided slightly. In and around that, we still get the occasional Opal 3, Opal 4, Opal 3 mainly from practices. So there are still some operational pressures out there in practices. But, you know, as Steph was saying, over recent months, the COVID infection levels have fallen dramatically, which has helped enormously in terms of practice workforce. But we do need to keep an eye out because those infection rates are rising again. And if they start to impact on practice workforce, we could see some, you know, issues, a return to those issues that we've had before in terms of patient access. And then just to kind of update the committee briefly on another piece of work around access, we're currently working with NHS England colleagues on a national contract with the PCNs, which effectively combines the enhanced access and extended access and extended hours schemes into a single contract, which is called the Enhanced Access Service, which will provide appointments to patients between the hours of 6:30 and 8 p.m. and from 9 to 5 on Saturdays. So we're currently working with practices and NHS England to try and understand how we can design that service so that it best meets the needs of each PCN's local population. Hopefully with a real focus on inequalities and trying to do bits of work, for example, to ensure that maybe patients who can't routinely get to the practice during working hours can access their practices at those times. And a real focus on doing some of the more prevention type work through that service as well, around sort of screening and vaccinating. So as we move into the ICS, the go live date for that service is the 1st of October. So we'll continue to kind of work with NHS England and report upwards into the ICB in terms of progress. But initial work and engagement with practices is kind of signalling that all of our PCNs are really on board with this work and already starting to plan for how they deliver that service from the 1st of October. And then lastly, we have the general practice wellbeing. Now, I don't have an update since the last update, the last report. There are a number of initiatives ongoing, which are detailed in this section of the report, but I don't have anything else to update at this stage. Thank you. So I'll stop there and happy to take any questions.
No, lovely, thank you. There's just a message in the chat box from Steph, and it's about the dip in the appointments for GPs during April, and it was national, so it was a dip nationally. So we were an outlier, so that just reassures ourselves and anyone that's logging in and listening to us. Okay, but thank you, Sean. That sounds very positive. Again, questions, comments for Sean, please. You see, this is because the reports are so good. We don't need to ask any questions.
Okay, we'd just be reiterating what you say, Julie. It's just a very positive picture.
Thank you, Sean. Right. Okay. Well, welcome, Gary. So I see Gary's joined us. Lovely to see you. We know you've been tied up on another meeting. We've had Zoom issues, so I don't know where we would rather have been. I think we might have preferred your meeting to the hiccup of Zoom. Apologies to Zoom people, but yeah. Would you like to do your slot now then? I'm not quite sure whether or not it's Gary speaking or whether it's Fiona. And it's a primary care update, please.
I think Fiona and I are going to do a bit of a relay race and we'll pass the baton sort of halfway through. And I don't know whether if Michelle can share some slides I sent through, it would make my life a little bit easier. I would struggle a bit.
Steph, can I ask you, because I think Michelle's working from, not working from the office.
I struggle to take notes and share, I'm sorry.
No, that's fine.
Steph, are you able to, or Sam?
I can, but I don't know that I've got them. Are they in the pack, Michelle?
No, I'll forward Gary's email.
Okay, thank you. Flick it on, start, and I'll be like the speed of lightning production.
Yeah, so last month we gave quite a detailed update on the Winter Access Fund and Winter Resilience, very much from a PCN perspective. And I think as this is the last primary care commissioning as York CCG, we want to give a report of our overview of how our 8 PCNs have performed over the last 3 years. And I'm just reading through my own slides as we go here. PCNs were introduced in July 2019, so just shy of 3 years ago. And the aim, the NHS England aim, was to get GP practices working together and then working towards the integrated care system. And I think of note is the fact that for 2 of the 3 years that PCNs have been commissioned, we've had 2 years of a global pandemic. And I think when we go through what our PCNs have achieved, I think we just have to bear that in mind, because I think it makes it even more noteworthy. So just going on to the next slide, Steph, the formation of PCNs. Andrew Lee reported to this committee in May 2020 that the 3 Vale PCNs had formed very much around distinct geographies, and that City had formed 5 PCNs, but there was still that historic split between the 2 groups of GPs in the city. And one of the things that PCNs was certainly a catalyst for in Central was bringing those 2 groups together under a shared clinical leadership, and they achieved that in June 20. So within a year of the PCN contract, and we can't really kind of overemphasize the significance of that coming together of practices if we think where we were 3 years ago or more, because I think it really did mark a new era of collaboration between the practices of York. And I think while I'm on this slide, the other thing that stood out to me was that the clinical directors that stepped into that clinical leadership role 3 years ago are very much still in place. And I think that continuity of clinical leadership accounts for an awful lot of what's been achieved. It's kept a sharp focus on what the PCNs are there for, which is to meet the population needs in their local areas. The only CD that's changed in Central was David Hartley, and he had a really clear plan for succession from day one, and James Berry stepped into that role really well. And I think the other interesting thing is that York Medical Group, Priory Medical Group, and York East have appointed a second clinical director to split the role. And it's allowed some of the Central PCNs to take on a wider clinical leadership role. So YMG notably appointed a nurse as their split clinical director, and I think that's been a really good move for the city. But also it's released Emma Broughton and Becky Field. They continue to co-chair the York Health and Care Collaborative. They attend the York Health and Wellbeing Board and the York Place Board. And then if we look at Dan Kimberling and Emma Allange, they've taken on that joint post as clinical directors in York Community Trust on behalf of the 8 PCNs. So the clinical leadership, I think, has been both strong and consistent right the way over the 3 years. And if we just go on to the next slide, a little bit about keeping on the clinical leadership side. I think what's interesting is, as well as the kind of organizational development and the development of system leadership skills that those clinical directors have had, they've also been instrumental in setting up or maintaining groups that address system issues. So in Selby, we have Selby Health Matters. There is a Vale System Partnership Group. In York, the Health and Care Collaborative is the genesis of that was Primary Care Home, and PCNs really cemented that with all the commissioners and all the providers in York around one table. And then in South Hamilton and Rydale, there's the Community Connect groups. So that clinical leadership, it's not just the clinical side, there's a system leadership to it as well that's been really clearly played out. We've gone to the challenges, Steph. Again, when Andrew reported to this committee back in May 2020, he highlighted 5 challenges that PCNs would face in the years ahead. There was the sustaining resilient general practice, responding to COVID, which we were just getting into at the time, delivering the wide range of the PCN specifications and contract needs. Allied to that was building out those wider partnerships for collaborative and integrated health delivery, and doing that in a wider transformation landscape. And we'll see some of that pull towards the end, where the current transformation leaves the PCNs feeling a wee bit nervous. We go on to the resilient slide. So we've said this before, and I think it's worth noting again, is that Baylor York CCG is unusual in that it's appointed 2 Band 8 lead officers for primary care, and that seniority of management and leadership to support the primary care networks to develop and stay strong. I just think is worth noting. And general practice resilience was one of the first pieces of work that we undertook. And at the core of it was the OPAL reporting framework. We've mentioned it before, particularly in the Winter Access Fund last time, but it is worth reflecting that to get this to work and to get the trust and assurance in place, the CCG worked with the PCNs and the LMC over quite an extended period of time. And when we finished that piece of work collaboratively between us all of our practices across the Vale of York now routinely use OPAL to report when they've got gaps in workforce or spikes of demand. And I put in the slide that it gives them an opportunity to flag up when their resilience is under pressure. But fundamentally, this is when it's an opportunity to highlight when patient care and staff safety is under pressure. And that's really at the heart of it. And I think on the back of OPAL, we've been able to put winter resilience schemes in place each winter. That's very much targeted around the practices that need the help most, kind of putting an umbrella of safety over all of our practices. And then obviously in winter, the winter just gone, we've already reported on the Winter Access Fund. In Central York, they've developed what they've called OPAL 2.5. So it's an early warning version of OPAL. They'll report a day or two before when they know they've got pressures. And the practices come together to support each other. So in Central York, we've got a self-supporting general practice resilience that's owned and led by general practice itself. And when we come to resilience, it's a staggering number. We've got over 100 whole-time equivalent additional roles through the PCN contract working across our 8 PCNs in a whole variety of roles. And the increase in access, it doesn't come without its problems because patients need signposting and directing, and social prescribers have been particularly good at that. But those 100 extra additional roles that only come through the PCN contract is absolutely staggering, actually. Go on to the next one for me, Steph, please. So urgent care, urgent primary care, same and next day care has had a really important part to play, particularly during COVID, when the emphasis had to be on supporting same day care, particularly when staff teams were under pressure. And I think we're going to see the importance of urgent care remain as we go through the period of COVID recovery. And in South Hambleton and Rydale, we've supported commissioning of 4 urgent care practitioners to work across that really large rural patch, which traditionally has had poor access to urgent care. And I think we've made a difference in that. Fee might want to put a comment in on that in a moment. In York, the PCNs through Nimbus Care provided additionality right through the winter to keep the UTC safe and staffed and put that protection in front of ED. And they also covered off the 2 long bank holidays that we've just had. And I think from their lived experience and the work that we've done in that transformation piece, they have a defined model of how a 24/7 integrated urgent primary care system could work. In Selby, the Urgent Care Transformation Group, which has recently been, it's made some real strides with Fiona leading that. And it is about getting the right model of care, that integration between urgent and primary care. And I think, interestingly, it's not just a conversation with the Selby UTC as a deliverer of care. It is a whole system conversation about how patients can access the right care when they need to. And in terms of the PCN specification for enhanced access, as Sean's just said, they're all the PCNs are working through what meets the needs of their practice and their populations to get that access in place. Move on to COVID for me, please, Steph. Managing COVID, I think, has been one of the challenges that the PCNs have risen to really well. And it's hard to imagine how without that collaborative working as PCNs, how they could have responded to COVID as well as they did. All practices have suffered really high numbers of staff absences through COVID sickness and self-isolation. All the PCNs set up hot hubs between them to have safe places to see COVID positive patients and keep their waiting rooms safe. Alongside that, remote working, not just because it was a safer way of managing the demand coming into practice, it also helped clinicians who were COVID positive or self-isolating themselves to continue to work and keep access as practical as it could be. And also from a technology point of view, a lot of the practices across the Vale of York have adopted Clinic as a front-end triaging model that helps them sort the work quicker to know who needs to be seen today, who needs to be seen tomorrow, and who needs a routine appointment. Just talking of Central and their COVID response, they established a COVID hub very early in COVID, which we've spoken about before, really to identify and support vulnerable patients and make sure they've got the right care. And the PCN influence in there is that that's now evolved as a partnership between the PCNs, Nimbus as the GP Federation, York Voluntary Sector and City of York Council. They're providing support for patients with long COVID and also starting to work through the long hospital waiting lists and to identify a mix of not just clinical risk of those waiting, but also the social risks, and then provide welfare and support calls for that. And I think the vaccination programme at every level has been a real success across the Vale of York. Just go on to the next one for me, please, Steph. The Nimbus Care through the central PCNs established the National Vaccination Centre at Askham Bar. And I think what's staggering is that they gave over 500,000 vaccinations, 558,000 at the last count. It's a staggering number of vaccinations to give. South Hambleton and Rydale set up 2 sites at Easingwold and Pickering, huge network of volunteers, partners across the board, and linked in with their flu campaign. That South Hambleton and Rydale PCN gained national recognition for their approach to delivering vaccines in rural communities. And in Selby, some innovative sites, so taking the Summit and then Sherburn Airfield and between them, they were delivering over 5,000 vaccines a week, reaching the most vulnerable in that really mixed community, including quite a large rural spread. And I think on that, I will hand over to Fiona, to pick up delivering the service specifications piece. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary. I think important, as Gary's touched on, to recognise that, you know, some of the key functions of PCNs were to deliver the national ask, but also to deliver what mattered most for people in their local populations. And that's quite a tension sometimes when you're delivering national targets, but have an eye on health improvements in other areas. So the PCNs have done an amazing job around delivering some of the national specs, which included things like improving health in care homes, looking at frailty particularly. So what the lead officer roles have been able to do with support from other colleagues in the CCG is help the PCNs deliver the national ask, but really bespoke the way they've done that to meet the needs of their local populations and take account of the structures that exist and the services in local populations. So care homes, for example, really great example of having a named GP for every care home. So there's continuity of care for residents who live in those settings, regular ward rounds, regular review of patients and medication, which has really enhanced the quality of support that residents are getting. And that's been really supported by the recent commissioning from the CCG of the Medicare offer in care homes, which is a telehealth solution. So that, with the focus on PCN support and that telehealth, has made a really big difference already in those settings. So it's a really good example of quality of care. Similarly, lots of work going on around frailty, which is a massive local and national agenda for us as well with our ageing population. And Sean's already touched on some of the work that we've done around mental health, particularly support for individuals with learning disabilities or serious mental illness, and some really great examples you can see on the screen there of projects that we've done to improve the number of people diagnosed with dementia as early as we can, to improve the level of support. Looking at how we co-produce the service offer. So if people find it difficult to access the services that are currently offered, why is that, and what adjustments can we reasonably make in primary care to make those services easier for people to get to? So some really great examples on that slide there of the work that's been going on across the Vale of York patch. Next slide, thanks, Steph. Social prescribing, we've touched on a lot in previous conversations, and I think the primary care networks have really embraced that in York through contracting with the health trainers to provide a wide range of support through social prescribing. But they've been really key posts across all of the Vale of York and in the Vale, and we're starting to see dedicated posts now that really pick up areas of inequality that need addressing, and with social prescribers focusing on particular patient cohorts. Population health is the bit I mentioned where really getting to grips with what matters to our local population is the really key nub of what PCNs are all about. And there's been some really impressive work on top of the pressures primary care have been under to deliver some local services. So in York, lots of work starting now around the impact of deprivation on people attending A&E and what that could look like in terms of a better offer for those cohorts of patients, and there's more work to be done on that through the summer. And I've mentioned some of the co-production we've been doing in the Vale, working with patients to find out what matters to them, what would make things easier for them to access, so that we can make reasonable adjustments to the way we deliver services. SHAR PCN have done a lot of work, as I said, around dementia again, and extending that into other areas of where there's perhaps a lower level of diagnosis than you would expect for our ageing population, and really trying to understand with partners why that is and address some of that. So some great examples, I think, of the population health approach, which is all about what matters for our local communities. Next slide, thanks, Steph. So a real sea change, I think Gary and I were talking earlier this week. If there was one point I think I'd pick out about the maturity of our primary care networks, it's absolutely been how they've developed their collaboration and working with partnerships, and working as part of a bigger system, which has been a big change for primary care. And I think that really strong clinical leadership that Gary touched on has been critical for us in terms of really embedding primary care in a conversation with wider system partners. That means we can work together to deliver solutions together, because no part of the system can improve health on its own. So I think all of the recognition from the work the PCNs have done is firmly embedded in the really strong relationships they've got with other wider partners like the Trust, like community services, like our voluntary sector. And it's been great to see some of the GP leadership taking roles in other bits of the system, for example, picking up roles in community services around clinical leadership and in other areas. And I think the lead officer roles, as Gary touched on, have really helped the PCNs to focus on that system development while we've helped them navigate some of the process that they've needed to go through to establish themselves as organisations. I think probably just worth mentioning, great as the relationships are, that's probably one of the things that the PCNs are most nervous about in the climate that we're in at the moment as we move into a new ICS structure. I think it's fair to say over the last 3-4 years, the relationships with primary care and CCG have been as strong as ever and have really, really developed, high trust and high integrity, lots of joint working. So I think the one thing they're most anxious about is making sure we don't lose those relationships as people move into slightly different roles or structures look different. There's no reason why that should change, but it's something we really need to make sure that we don't lose and that we carry on building on that really strong platform that we've got. Next slide, thanks, Steph. So we've given you loads of examples. It's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but there's a couple of things on this slide about some of the continued challenges that PCNs will need to deal with. Particularly looking at things like standardising clinical systems, and Sean and the team have done some great work to help support practices moving on to single systems. So I think by the end of the year, virtually all of our practices will all be moved onto System 1. There's been a big programme of migration, which isn't an easy thing to do when you're juggling a pandemic and high levels of demand. We know that our practices across the Vale of York have delivered over 1.5 million appointments this year, and it's still not enough to meet the growing demand. So things like standardised digital systems will be a really key enabler for us to sort of improve efficiency and offer even more choice for patients. And it's really great that we're getting people onto the same system, because that integrates with our partners. So it means if we're on System 1, we can work more closely with our community colleagues. We're looking at urgent care services being moved onto System 1. So really starts to look at more seamless services that make sense. So really key, and there's some of the challenges that we've got that we still need to tackle as we move forward. And the last slide, Steph. And I guess whilst it's really important, and we've talked about the importance of localisation and working at a neighbourhood level to meet the needs of our populations, it is kind of nice to know that we've also got some national recognition for some of the work that our practices and PCNs have done. Clearly Nimbus Care, loads and loads of great good news stories in the national profile around the work they've done on their mass vaccination site. But also nice to see one of our smallest PCNs, South Hamilton and Rydale, being runners-up in the National PCN of the Year awards very early on in their lifespan as a PCN, which was great. And lots of examples of our PCNs presenting at national conferences and in national profiles. So some great good news stories, I think, that other people outside of our localities are really starting to take notice of the work that's been done across Vale of York. So I think it's fair to say that across primary care and the CCG, we are hugely proud of the practices and hugely proud of the work, excuse me, that they've done this year. I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona and Gary. And I think they should be hugely proud for such a young setup to read all of that. And that's just the bullets, really, of what it is. We all know that it's bigger than that. It's absolutely amazing. If I can just take this opportunity before I open the floor to say, during the last meeting, Andrew Moriarty asked me about the decompression sessions or support for GPs, given the emotional pressure that they're under and their need for sometimes for confidentiality, even amongst their peers, just to reassure them that the ICS has that in hand, and there will be a suite of gifts, I guess, for them to pick from. But people are very keen to engage and ensure that our GPs are well looked after, the same as everyone else is. Okay, and if I can just say before I go any further, because I don't want to forget this, and I should have sent you both a thank you note. So Gary and Fiona, you were mentioned at QPEC in dispatches as we were talking about quality and performance, and I think it's your gentle warmth and dedication that that has enabled the PCNs to work so closely with us. So thank you both. Right, questions or comments, please?
I'm repeating myself. It must be my age, Julie. Just to offer my personal congratulations to Fiona and Gary and the wider CCG team. Above all the other positive reports on today's agenda, this one speaks volumes about the mature, highly productive professional and personal relationships across the CCG with principal clinical partners, and that can only be to the benefit of patients. And just continuing the relay metaphor, I really hope that the ICS picks up the CCG's baton and isn't going to try and fix something that ain't broken. So congratulations, my personal thanks and congratulations to everyone involved. Thank you.
Yes, I could only echo that. I couldn't add anything to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. I'd love to keep that recording and play it maybe at our end of the show. So I don't know whether we're able to do that. Otherwise, I'm going to have to ask Phil and David to do a separate shot for us, a little screenshot. Thank you, everyone. Very much appreciated. And again, an excellent report, brilliant to read, and very, very heartwarming. We know, we always know there's a lot to do, and our faith is in a lot of our colleagues again that will be part of the new ICS team, just to reassure everyone, and hopefully Place will be instrumental in strengthening that. Gary.
Just before we go off, I noticed that Fiona Phillips isn't here, and I just wanted to, as a matter for the minutes, to thank Fiona. At the last meeting, she said she was going to arrange a meeting between GPs and York City councillors, which she did, and she facilitated and navigated that meeting superbly. And I think that needs saying. Local councillors can be a hostile bunch because what they hear is all the negativity from patients who say they can't. But what they don't hear is all the patients who get superb care. And we balanced that out. And Fiona was superb at that. We ended the meeting with local councillors agreeing unanimously that they wanted to support and be seen to support GPs, which I thought was a fantastic outcome. And then there's also a piece of work probably that we can do with Health Watch, where we can take patient participation groups and use them almost as a pre-made panel to get a very wide but slightly informed view of what the real pressures are in general practice, rather than trying to respond to very often media-led rhetoric. So we can address real problems that we understand rather than trying to respond to noise that's generated in the front page of the Daily Mail, as for example. So I just want to note, thanks to Fiona for setting that up. It was the GPs that were nervous before they went into the room, and Fiona did a marvellous job. So, thank you.
Thank you, Gary. I think from both parties, it's a hard meeting to have, isn't it? Because as a counsellor, you're representing other people. As a GP, you know exactly what you're doing and what you've been delivering. But none of us like that bad press, and especially when you think what everyone is going through at this moment in time. So my huge thanks to Fiona for doing that. The outcome's wonderful. Health Watch, thank you always for having our back. So I'm not sure whether you're staying with us, Gary and Fiona, or if you've got to dash off, but thank you so much, and looking forward to seeing you both soon in person, I hope. Yep, I think you're staying. Yep. Brilliant. Lovely. Thank you. It's always good to have a good full house. Right. Okay. So the next bit is over to Sean, and this is about our GP retainers.
Thank you, Julie. So the purpose of this paper, in a nutshell, is to ask the committee if we can agree to extend the budget for our GP retainers for this financial year. So just to give you a bit of background, the GP retainer scheme is managed jointly between Health Education England and NHS England. And what it's intended to do is help GPs who wouldn't routinely be working in sort of mainstream practice to provide some input and some sessions. Maybe people who are thinking about retiring because they don't want to do a full-time GP job, for example. People who might have left the profession to have children or whatever and want to come back on sort of a part-time basis. So in that context, it's a really helpful scheme in terms of enabling GPs to come back into work and do up to 4 sessions a week for a time period of 5 years. And I think we'd all agree that, you know, in the context of our current demand, every GP session and appointment that we can provide is a fairly precious commodity, isn't it? So as we've gone through this scheme, we've noticed that it's become increasingly popular, certainly over the past year, which is great in that it means that we get more GPs coming in and providing more appointments for our patients. But as well as that, we have a financial pressure on our general practice budget in the CCG. And we went into this financial year with a plan to spend, it's approximately 120,000 on our GP retainers. But as we've come into this year, we've had a couple more applications, one which we've approved already and one which has just come in, which would take our required spend for our GP retainers up to 145,000, nearly 146,000 this year against the 120,000 plan. Now, it's a bit of a moving feast. From the paper, you can see we have a table showing at what stage these GPs are in that 5-year cycle. We have one which I'd highlighted, which is in year 6. And the reason for that is that GP took maternity leave for a year. So on that basis, the GP can come in for another year, year 6, as they had a year out. So we would expect that GP to be dropping off the scheme at the end of this year. And we also have another GP in year 5, and they would be coming up to the end of the scheme. So there will be some movement in the spend from year to year as GPs come on and drop off the scheme. But it would be advantageous, I think, this year if we could accept the GPs that have come into the scheme or expressed an interest to come into the scheme this year. But obviously we need to agree that cost pressure of circa 25,000 on our plan for this scheme. So I'll pause there and just ask if anybody's got any questions or comments on that proposal.
Thank you, Sean. Questions or comments, please?
Just one from me, Julie. I just wonder where the additional budget provision's coming from. It's small in the context of the CCG's overall budget, but I read the paper a number of times and I didn't see where the additional 25.5 grand's coming from.
Yes, that's a fair comment, Phil. And technically, this is funded out of our baseline, our GMS allocation, which I'm sure that Simon will probably explain is probably fully committed at this point. So there isn't a straightforward route to increase that budget, but I'd be grateful if Simon could explain his views.
Yes, Simon, please.
Okay, thanks. To indulge myself a little bit, as this is the last PCCC, for those old enough to remember the character CJ from The Fall and Rise of Reginald Perrin.
I'm old enough.
I didn't get where I am today by approving spend that we have no budget and no plan to offset. So I think what the paper is rightly doing is saying this is a good scheme, it's useful, it supports general practice. There is at this point a cost pressure, but I know primary care colleagues will be committed to delivering spend within budgets, and so will throughout the rest of the financial year look to identify potential underspends and then use that as the way to make sure that this potential cost pressure is fully mitigated during the year. I think that was the only bit that wasn't in the paper, because as you say, Phil, it's a relatively small amount, but I think dotting I's and crossing T's, that would have been the correct conclusion for the paper to draw.
Thank you, Simon. You've made us giggle, and some of us were old enough. Right, any more questions or comments? No. Okay.
So are we agreeing that then? We're saying we can afford it?
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, David. Yes. As our finance chair, I would expect you to make sure I've got my ducks in a row here. Yes. If we can agree on that, and if I can at the same time thank Sean for the paper and the hard work that went on behind getting the information for us with Steph, I know as well. So
yeah, just then my thanks to the committee then for that decision, and I think what I also noted in the paper is, however this moves forward into the ICB, we will obviously monitor any sort of further applications over the course of the financial year and just manage those accordingly. But if we can sign this latest one off for My Health, that would be much appreciated. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Simon. You've got no negatives, but we've got a comment from Steph.
Yeah, it's for Dave Eiley, really. So we're just going through the process of the scheme of delegation for primary care about how decisions will be made. But I do think this is the first time actually that the Vale of York has been faced with a cost pressure on the GP retention scheme. I know colleagues in North Yorkshire had circa 8 people utilising the scheme a couple of years ago, but this is part of a wider approach to retaining staff, so that it takes the cost burden away from practices. But as we move to the ICB, we probably do need to have a more proactive conversation about this, Dave, so that we're not dealing with it on a one-off basis, because it is the ICS budget that may or may not be delegated to place. It's generally been a good thing, and it's one of those things where we've said, if you're on the scheme, you're on the scheme, and therefore you are supporting applications, and if they are compliant applications, then we should support it. But we all anticipate moving forward into an environment where we are more financially challenged, and therefore we're going to have to look at every aspect of the components that make up the picture of delivering primary care. I just think it's one we shouldn't let slide. And of course, the governance is that this is rightly an appropriate question for the Vale of York, but a significant number of those retainers on that scheme will move with the Vale transition into North Yorkshire Place. So we just need to be mindful of both the disaggregated allocation at Place, but also the bigger picture across the ICS. So I just asked Dave just to keep a watching brief on that, about how we handle it with partner organisations.
Yeah, that's fine, Steph. I think this is similar to where we were. It was Hanwich and Whitby CCG had a huge amount of retainers on. I think they had about 11 for, at the time, relatively small CCG, which impacted the budget. And it's an odd scheme, obviously, all the benefits, but Health Education England received the applications and weren't particularly good at communicating what was coming through, or it's not that you can sort of see what's necessarily coming through the pipeline. So it's difficult to sort of prioritize one over the other because they come through at different times. And I think that after a couple of discussions, it was a view of, you know, workforce is probably the topmost priority. And I think, as Simon said, it's almost you've got to accept the pressure and find a way to fund it. But we can certainly, I think in North Links and North East Links, they didn't have a lot of retainers going back a couple of years. But I'd imagine that their budgets are just allocated to the spend as opposed to sort of an actual underspend. So I think we can look at how many we've got across the entire ICS, and it might find it evens out.
Yeah, and the retainers are going to want to work where they want to work. It isn't that there's a gap in the workforce at one bit of the ICS, and therefore you can direct anybody who expresses an interest in being part of the retainer scheme to the bit where we've got a vacancy. But this might be one where we want to consider the budget being held at ICS level to manage the movement around.
Yeah, I think I think we can have that conversation. Absolutely. Thank you for flagging that up, Steph. Yeah, and I think for me, it's reassuring that we've got our eye on the future, which it firmly needs to be at this moment in time. So just to make sure that Michelle has got our decision, we've voted yes on that, please, on the GP retainers. David, it's over to you now anyway, please, if you can update us on your report. No problem. This is regarding Sherburn Group practice and their capital estates scheme and bid. So this proposal has been to Primary Care Commission Committee a few times with various updates and for decisions, in that also including November 21, when the committee was asked to support the submission of a project initiation document by Sherburn Group practice to bid for capital to support an estates development. The committee was supportive of that. So following approval of the PID, the practice went out to tender on the works and are now in a position to submit a business justification case, which is in essence a light touch business case, to NHS England to secure the capital for the scheme. As I say, this extra step was needed just due to the scale of the scheme and the capital spend. So just to remind you, the scheme would see an extension and reconfiguration of the existing premises to create much needed clinical capacity for the growing population and to house additional role staff. And the existing practice is actually much too small for the current practice list size. So there's definitely a need to do something here. As the scheme is being jointly funded through NHSE Capital Council funding and a practice contribution, the revenue impact for the scheme will be abated for 15 years. So the current market rent for the practice is £57,500 per annum. And upon completion of the works, the district value has assessed that the CMR would be £117,200 per annum. But as I said, the abated CMR for the 15-year period from completion of the works would actually be £73,400. So we're just asking the committee to support the approval of the business justification case once it's completed, which it is close to completion now. We just couldn't share it at the time the papers were needed. And support the revenue impact identified, acknowledging the scheme has already been approved at PID stage, and actually the revenue consequences are lower than what was approved in the original PID. And the reason for that, the scheme hasn't changed much, but actually once we've factored in the contribution from the council, the practice contribution to the scheme is 16.7% of the costs, and the figures we factored in for the PID was assuming a practice contribution of a third of the costs. So it's ultimately the abatement's better from a commissioner point of view. So we're just asking the committee to approve the business justification case based on the revenue impact identified there.
Thank you, David. Questions or comments? Simon, have you anything to add for us?
No, happy with that.
That's reassuring. Thank you.
Fine.
Yeah, see no reason why we wouldn't want to approve it. Seems like a win-win-win.
Yeah, yeah. And as David said, we have had this by our committee before. So yes, it looks like you've got a complete and utter approval there, David. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Lovely. Right, we're working down our list. We're at any other business if I've ticked everything that I should have ticked off. And Steph's asked to talk about Linton and Ouse. So can I hand it over to you, Steph?
Thank you. I'll keep this brief and apologies that it's verbal. It's a fairly fluid situation, but I just wanted to comment on some of the material that's already in the public. So the Home Office, it became apparent towards the back end of April that the Home Office were looking for alternatives to temporary hotel accommodation to support asylum seekers coming into the UK, predominantly England. And one of the proposals that they were looking at was RAF Linton on Ouse. So that's a former RAF site, decommissioned in 2020 and declared surplus by the MOD in 2021. So that site has been looked at by the Home Office as alternative accommodation that would help support the growing numbers of asylum seekers, but also start to try and move away from the reliance of private hotel accommodation, which is funded from the public purse. So RAF Linton is being looked at. If you think about the infrastructure of that site, it did home predominantly male, single male, although I understand there was a family of accommodation, 60 properties of family accommodation, and the infrastructure around that, rec hall, food hall, offices. It had a GP surgery on site. And so the Home Office have been looking at utilising that for asylum seekers. Clearly, if you've been watching the local news, there is a significant amount of local opposition, given the rurality of that site and the site for asylum seekers overwhelming the village. From a CCG point of view, the closest GP practice is Tollerton Surgery. It's part of Shah PCN, so until the 30th of June, it sits within the Vale of York geographical area. So together with Andrew Dangerfield from North Yorkshire CCG, we've just been sat alongside the Home Office, listening and understanding what the health requirement would be if that site goes forward. It's currently in some discussions with a legal challenge around the use of that site for its intended new purpose. We've worked with our local providers to understand the impact on the local GP practice. And so we're looking at, if the service goes forward, an alternative solution to that, really just to recognise that to, in effect, land a new cohort onto what are small rural services has the danger of having a negative impact on those current services. So as commissioners, we are looking at what our duty of care is. So anybody coming into the UK has the covenant of the NHS, with one or two exceptions, notably tourists who have private insurance. And so it's just to really reassure the committee that we are looking at this and balancing those two needs: duty of care to these asylum seekers who are in our care, and also balancing the needs of our local population and our current services that are recovering from COVID and will just continue to support that work together. I've met with regional colleagues. I've met with NHS England colleagues, and as I say, North Yorkshire and the Vale of York, in terms of North Yorkshire and York Place going forward, are working together on this, and we're in discussions with local partners, including the public health team in North Yorkshire Local Authority. So I just wanted to expand on what you may have heard in the mainstream media and local media about that.
Thank you for the update, Steph. A very interesting proposition, I think. Questions or comments, please? No. To me, it's a wonderful environment, I think, because it's got so many positives for people. But it's just that issue of, you know, making sure that the NHS can provide the services, and that and I guess the rurality that is the real issue. Any other business? Okay. If anyone has anything particular that they'd like to add to governing body, it's written in any particular way than my terminology, please send me an email. Otherwise, I will put a few bullet notes to governing body. Normally, my next little box would say the time of the next meeting, which of course it doesn't. So this is the point. I put my pen down, put my glasses down, and just say an absolute massive thank you to every single member of this team, the wider team that supported it, our partners that unfortunately we haven't got a huge number of those here today because, like us, they're overwhelmed with trying to move towards the ICS. And that's from local authority partners to Health Watch partners to the rest of the voluntary sector. But a massive thank you to each and every one, and wishing you all the very best in the ICS and at Place. And I look forward to seeing you anyway soon at our governing body meeting, and some of you before. Okay, take care, enjoy the lovely warm sunshine, and look forward to